Facebook, as well as going out to all those people who registered for today's special event. So we can now formally launch the webinar. Welcome everyone. I'm Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au, and today I'm with Chris Christofi, from the founder and CEO of Reventon. And I'll introduce Chris in a moment. He'll tell us a little bit more about who Reventon is and what they do. But today we're particularly looking at three regional areas which, as we said in our promotion, are set to explode. I think it's very important to talk about these areas because media is very much obsessed with what's happening in our two biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. Most of the real estate coverage focuses on those areas. And there's a tendency to extrapolate what's happening there across the whole of Australia. So with those markets recently in their post-boom correction phase with a downturn in prices, there was a tendency of media to tell us that real estate prices were falling across Australia. Now at Hotspotting, and I'm sure at Reventon as well, we know that's simply not the truth. There's lots of growth markets in Australia, have been for the last couple of years and continue to be. Many of them are in regional Australia, and that's why we're going to focus on that subject today. We often say at Hotspotting that investing in good regional areas is a win-win-win situation. The first win is cheaper prices, the second is better rental yields, and the third is really good capital growth, as we'll see as we talk about these specific locations. Be aware that towards the end of today's broadcast, there will be some special offers from Reventon, and also your opportunities to ask questions of both myself and Chris by typing your questions into the Q&A panel or the chat box that you should see in front of you. So Chris Christofi of Reventon, welcome. Tell us a little bit about who Reventon is for those who don't know too much about you and what you do for property investors.
Excellent. Well, Reventon's been around since 2005. We've helped thousands of Australians get into the property market. We're a holistic, fully integrated financial services platform. So our companies include obviously property advice, residential lending, property management, accounting and financial planning. I'm fortunate enough to say we're a multi-award winning company, both in lending, accounting and planning. Last year alone in residential lending, we settled over $167 million, and we've helped countless of Australians. Our goal is to help as many Australians grow, protect and build their wealth through real estate. And it's something that I've been passionate about. I got into the market initially when I was 19, and it's something I fell in love with, and I want to help as many people as possible achieve financial security. So that's how Reventon was born, and that's how Reventon grows year in, year out.
I've had a lot of investors tell me that one of the things they find frustrating as property investors is they've got to go so many places to get everything they need. They go to one place for advice, another place for research, another place for finance, etc., etc. But what you're telling us is that Reventon, to a certain extent at least, is a one-stop shop for many of the needs that a property investor would have.
100%. And I wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to get into the property market, but more importantly, to get the advice they need, because you don't know what you don't know. And the first step is always the hardest. So what I wanted to bring all these professionals together under one brand or one umbrella is so we can have the same level of service, the same customer satisfaction, but more importantly, that we all understand exactly what the goals and objectives of each client is. So my goal is to help them get into the market the first time, pay off their mortgage and duplicate it over and over. We've had clients pay off their mortgage within 6 years. We've got clients that have bought 7, 8 properties off us. So that's the reason I love real estate, and I think it's definitely the safest and the best way to build wealth.
Well, Chris, I've been dealing with Reventon for something like 10 years, and I know you well. And I know that you have been, on behalf of your clients, you've had a particular focus on some of the better regional areas of Australia in recent times. We're going to talk about 3 specific areas today to provide an example of the sorts of opportunities that exist for property investors in these places and the sort of results that can be achieved, because I know that your clients have achieved some really strong capital growth results in the last couple of years in some of these places.
And one thing I do want to mention, Terry, we do a lot of independent research because I think it's very, very important. But as you know, and I'll bring everyone's attention, I also use independent advice as well for some of the best people in the country, like yourself and Hotspotting. So before I go into an area and I do my due diligence very, very thoroughly, I make sure that it meets all of it's Reventon approved. I make sure that I run a report through Hotspotting as well, because it's invaluable, the knowledge that we get from you as well. And the last question, which is I think would I invest in that area, and would I put my family and friends in that area? And if that doesn't meet all three of those checks, I won't list that stock. I won't sell that stock. So I think that's very important to do your own due diligence, but also have independent advice that suggests exactly these areas are good. And I think that's one of the key factors to why we've found great success for our clients.
Yeah. Well, when we're discussing these issues a little bit earlier today, one of the things you told me is that you personally have invested in the first of the locations that we're going to talk about today, and that's the city of Geelong. And I understand why you have all the investors who are our clients who have invested there, say 2 or 3 years ago, are absolutely delighted that they did, because they've had great results. And I think you personally have, and your clients also.
Yeah, well, I sell many, many properties in Geelong. I personally, in the last couple of years, I think I've bought 10 or 11 properties in Geelong alone. And I think it's a very strong market. It's one that we advise on, but we also, most of my team have also bought in that area. Now, the beauty of Geelong is it's grown so much, but we've actually been investing in Geelong since 2014. So when people are going Geelong, 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 and they're getting in the market now or a year ago, we've actually been there since 2014, because we predicted these things were going to happen way before they did, which is why my clients have seen in today's market, double-digit growth is, you wouldn't say it's unheard of, but it's uncommon, and that's what my clients are experiencing in today's market. And you mentioned before as well, Terry, tax savings, capital growth, and cash flow, and these regional areas are offering all three, which I agree 100% and wholeheartedly with. That's why we're in those areas.
Yeah. Now, Geelong, we've been telling our customers about Geelong for a number of years as well. It's been featured very prominently in our national reports. We see it as a very, very strong regional economy. We believe that real estate markets arise out of what's happening in the local economy. It's not so much about those background national issues like the level of interest. They certainly help, but we're not going to have a booming market in a regional city unless the regional economy is strong. Now, Geelong is one of the strongest regional economies in Australia. It just has so much happening, and it continues to do so. It certainly benefits from its proximity and good transport links to Melbourne, but it's a very strong regional city in its own right. And what we have seen that's happened very successfully with Geelong is that it's evolved from what you might call an old style economy, where there was a lot of blue collar industry, manufacturing, etc. And it's evolved successfully, more so than most locations in Australia, into a modern economy where the biggest employers now are the health sector, the education sector, IT, tourism, and government services.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a lot of factors why it grew. Obviously, the government grant helped people get into their first home, greenfielding, so people obviously buying and making a lot of money on the land as well. So there's a lot of key factors, but that were the main drivers that you mentioned, Terry, and that's why it's been such a strong market and has been, well, since 2014. And I still think there's a long way to go there as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that certainly helped Geelong was the regional rail link, a $5 billion project, which was completed a couple of years ago. That's improved and sped up rail links from Geelong to Melbourne. The upgrade of Avalon Airport is another important factor going international. Yep. And you couple that with the fact that Geelong also has a very, very important export seaport, the largest in regional Australia, in fact. These are all incredibly important parts in the economy of Geelong.
Yep, agreed. And we've seen all those things play out as well.
I think government agencies is a very important part of the mix as well. We're seeing a trend across Australia where governments of all descriptions, the federal government, but particularly state governments, are wanting to decentralise a lot of their head offices for a lot of government departments, and they're moving them to regional cities like Geelong. So Geelong now has WorkSafe headquartered there, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme is also headquartered in Geelong. And that's been a huge boon for the economy of Geelong, because it not only for the establishment of those particular agencies in Geelong, but a lot of private businesses want to be close because they provide services, and there's an advantage in being physically proximate to them. So we're seeing a lot of new businesses establishing in the downtown sort of CBD areas of Geelong, and that's added enormously to the economy. It's created jobs, and it's adding to the population growth statistics. Geelong currently has a population of about 235,000, but it's projected that within 5 or 6 years it's going to be 290,000, and in about 15 years, it's going to be 320,000. So it's very much projected to continue to be one of the growth cities of Australia.
Well, it's offering affordable living as well and a great area to invest. And when the bullet train does go, which is more of a long-term play, that's going to really affect the price again in a positive sense. And as you said, by creating all these jobs there, these big companies are realizing it's a much cheaper place. People can live close to work without the congestion of being in a major capital city. It's much more of an affordable alternative. It's driving these massive corporations to open up offices there, which is driving the local economy and in sense driving the property up, which what a win-win.
Yeah, and it's also a lifestyle location. I think that's often forgotten as well. Geelong is essentially on a peninsula surrounded by water, so it's got sort of safe harbour water. It's also got surf beaches, and so it's not only a more affordable alternative to Melbourne, but it's a lifestyle affordable alternative, and that's one of the factors that's drawing more and more people there. They can live cheaply and they can live well.
And it's less hustle and bustle, like major regional capital cities, Victoria, Sydney. It's just so busy all the time. When you actually go out in those areas, because I go to Port Idington a bit, it's just much more of a relaxed lifestyle. You can park your car, and it doesn't take half an hour to drive 3 kilometres. And I think it's appealing to a lot more people because I can see the frustration because we're getting more overpopulated in these capital cities. It's a great alternative.
Yeah, and it has a ring road, which was established in recent years, which makes it a lot easier to get around as well. But if we could talk perhaps a little bit more about some of the real estate characteristics. Looking at our list of Geelong suburbs, the first thing that stands out is the affordability. They're still suburbs, despite the growth that we've seen in the last couple of years, and many suburbs have grown 20% in a single year in their median prices. There are still suburbs of Geelong with median prices in the 300,000s, more also in the 400,000 and 500,000s. There's quite a range because there are some top-level prestige suburbs, and there was an article which was published just in the last week or so, recording the fact that Barwon Heads, which is part of the Geelong market, has passed the $1 million mark. It's become the first $1 million suburb of Geelong, so it's joined the elite of Melbourne in that regard, but it's indicative of the sort of growth we're seeing there in the last couple of years.
It's just unbelievable, Terry, how often I'm hearing $1 million suburbs now. I heard Melt, $1 million suburb, which, in Geelong, $1 million suburb, it's become so prevalent now in real estate. Pretty much every area is $1 million suburb, and which means it's more important to get into the market at an affordable rate and build your equity. And now's a great time due to the financial climate and how cheaply you can lend money, I guess.
Okay. So Geelong does offer that variety, that range of price ranges for investors with all sorts of budgets, from Barwon Heads, now the median price above $1 million, right down to locations like North Lane and Corio, where the median prices are still sort of mid to high 300,000. So still very affordable. Another thing, Chris, that stands out for me is looking at the figures is the number of suburbs in the city of Greater Geelong where the long-term growth rates are comparable to the best in Sydney and Melbourne. And by that, I mean the average over 10 years. It's always very instructive to look at that. And many of the suburbs of Geelong have averaged 8 or 9% per year for the last 10 years. That's a tremendous growth rate.
It is, and people don't actually look at all that. But when you look at 1 year rate, I think what you said is a lot smarter and a more secure way to look at it. You got to look at things over an 8 or 10 year period to see, is it sustainable? How's it perform? Because something that might spike up or spike down, what happens in the next 3 or 4 years? It's always a question I ask. It's done this year. What's it done over the last 5 to 10 years? Because that's very, very important when you look at real estate, I think.
Absolutely. And the other standout characteristic for me, for the Geelong market, is just how low the vacancy rates are. There is one exception, perhaps a little bit higher than average, but the vast majority of the postcodes that cover the city of Greater Geelong have vacancy rates around 1%, 1.5%. Now that means very tight rental market. And we also have figures that came out in the last week or so from CoreLogic saying that Geelong has had more rental growth than any other regional city anywhere in Australia. And that's obviously a reflection of that very, very tight vacancy rate.
Yeah, I read that, and I was pleasantly surprised, but it's not that unexpected when you consider all the factors and all the contributing things to why that is the case.
Yeah. So when you have a market that has a strong economy, creating jobs, projected strong population growth, affordable prices, very low vacancies, rents are growing, which means rental returns are growing, and a history of capital growth,
yep.
You can start to believe that this location has long-term prospects. And Chris, at Hotspotting, I know it's the same for Reventon, we always think long-term. It's nice to have short-term growth, but we really want to see our clients buying in areas where they're going to get growth for not just 1 to 2 years, but for 5 years, for 10 years and beyond.
100%, Terry. And what I always say, are you a property investor or a property speculator? A speculator tries to buy low, sell high. But what you need to consider in a short period of time, there's also cost to enter the marketplace: stamp duty, LMIs, loan costs, solicitors' fees, capital gains tax. So all of those will lead into your profits. And it's a lot harder to predict the market. But when you're a long-term investor and you buy and hold, and if you look at one of the wealthiest men in the world, he does that with shares, Warren Buffett, he takes a long-term view in holding shares. And I believe the same thing in real estate. Taking a long-term view is much more safe and more predictable. And it's a good strategy to employ, and it's one that I employ personally.
Yeah. It's an interesting point that there's an often a debate about whether it's time in the market or timing the market. Yeah. And I know we agree on this. It's very much time in the market. And interestingly, Pippa, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, did some research which they published just a couple of weeks ago, where they actually explored that issue, and they found that by conducting research and results in all the capital cities of Australia, that very much it's the case that people who buy with a long-term view and hold assets long-term get much better capital growth results over time than people who try to trade in and out, time entry to the market and get their timing to exit the market right. They eat up a lot of their capital growth in fees, stamp duty, solicitors' fees, etc., whereas people who just buy something good and keep it long-term do much better.
Well, Terry, let me ask you, between us, we've got 60 years collective experience, yeah? So we know the market quite well. How hard is it to predict the market in short term, to consider and navigate your costs and all these things that we've both mentioned and make a profit at the end of it? You've got to have a ton of knowledge. It's pretty difficult, isn't it?
It's very hard. Even for someone like myself, I've spent a lifetime researching and writing about real estate, and our business is based around knowing the best time to buy in a market. So that's something we're particularly good at. But as they say, no one rings a bell when the bottom of the market is reached. Most people out there don't have the access to the sorts of resources that we do and that Reventon does, unless they're a client of yours. And so they're kind of reliant on media. And by the time media tells us that a market's rising, that a boom's happening, the best time to buy is already passed by 12 months. It's probably 12 or 18 months they should have bought.
That's a great point. It's like I always say to clients, what good are the lotto numbers for a week ago? They're not going to be any good, are they?
Absolutely right. Pretty similar in real estate. A lot of people, I get so many contacts from people who bought in places like Gladstone, where there was a massive spike in values, and then the market became oversupplied and values fell. And it was by the time people realised, it was too late for them to get out of that market. And because, as I say, no one rings a bell to announce the change in the market cycle, that the market had peaked and was starting to turn down the other side, exacerbated by a vast oversupply in that case.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I want to note, you look at Glen Waverley, Mount Waverley, how well it grew, but I'm always very, very cautious of any area, Terry, that spikes very quick, because usually comes down very quick. You use Gladstone as an example. You look at Mount Waverley, Glen Waverley, it was what I call an artificial demand for these pieces of real estate, underpinned by whether it may be the mining, or in Glen Waverley, Mount Waverley, was the school restrictions, or a lot of Chinese buyers are going into the market. If it goes up quick, I'm always cautious that it's going to come down quick as well. And it's always, and you look at any areas that it's done, and in most cases tonight, what goes up quick comes down quick in real estate. I'm always very cautious of that, because it's underpinned by one or two things. It hasn't got all these factors like Geelong and the areas we're going to discuss. That's underpinned by 4 or 5 key aspects, which I think makes it a lot more solid.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of the analogy between the hare and the tortoise. I like real estate tortoises, places that chug along and provide steady growth long term, rather than those rapid spikes, because as you point out, a rapid spike is often followed by a fairly deep trough.
Right.
One of the things that we always look for in terms of the underlying characteristics that provide that solid long-term performance is a diverse economy. Geelong, we've just discussed, certainly provides that. It's one of the reasons we like it. Perhaps if we could now turn our attention to another regional Victorian market, which is the city of Ballarat, and that also offers that same characteristic. It's got a wonderfully diverse economy, a very strong one, a growing population, good transport links to Melbourne, and a whole lot more. You've been in that market, Chris. What do you like about it?
Well, okay, just to put it blunt, it's like a mini Geelong. It is a lot smaller. It's Bendigo and Ballarat are kind of the second largest regional city. They go toe for toe in terms of populations and growth opportunities. I like that it's affordable to get into the market. So it's very good entry level stock. You don't have to get a loan that's too big, so you can actually pay that loan a lot quicker. The rental yields are very good and the vacancy rates are very low. So these contributing factors means that your risk isn't as high of buying a property that's a lot more expensive. And as I said before, it's like a younger Geelong, so to speak. And one key factor, which this is a long-term play, but I'd like to mention it, the rail link, when that goes in and gets to Melbourne a lot quicker, makes it easier to commute, I think the price will have another quite a large hike. So what I like about all those things that I mentioned, and we've been selling in those areas as well, because affordability and getting into the market at a great rate.
Yeah. All of that is underpinned by a very solid economy. I mentioned diversity. I think it's a very important factor for Geelong, and it's also equally so for Ballarat. There's some manufacturing. It's surrounded by agricultural areas. Education sector is very strong, gets a lot of tourism because it's a city with a lot of history, including the gold mining history. Those sorts of areas, Ballarat and also Bendigo get tourists from China looking for ancestors who worked in the goldfields way back in those days. It's a massive...
Late 1800s or something, wasn't it? That's a long time ago.
It's a major part of their economy. They're also very big on health services, retailing. There's still some mining. And what's become very big is actually wind farms in the areas just outside of Ballarat. There's 3 projects which collectively represent investment of about $3 billion, which are in the mix. All these things add to the strength and diversity of the economy of Ballarat, and that's one of the reasons why its population is actually projected to double in the next 20 years. It's currently a bit over 100,000, as I think you just mentioned, Chris, but by the year 2040 is expected to be over 200,000. So it's just going to keep on growing.
That's amazing, though. When you think about it, within it's about 107, 109 last time I read, but within 20 years, 21 years, it's going to almost double in population. What a massive difference to any regional city, any city.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it gives you confidence when if you're a homeowner living there with a life and a career there, it gives you confidence that you're in a centre that's got a future. It's going to keep on keeping strong, that you're going to continue to have a job. We're seeing, and I know you're seeing this as well, a lot of the impetus for the market in Ballarat is coming out of buyers out of Geelong, both home buyers and investors, because Ballarat has the advantage of being within commuting distance of the capital city. There's lots of jobs being created in Ballarat, so it's conceivable to have work and a career within Ballarat itself. But for those who have careers in Melbourne, it's conceivable that you can buy very cheaply there, have a different type of lifestyle, and commute back to Melbourne, either by car or by rail. The rail links have certainly improved in recent years, and there's further upgrades to come. Yeah,
we're seeing a lot more of that too. And the regional grant, which has obviously doubled in regional areas, has helped the first home buyers get into the marketplace. The stamp duty concessions, if it's under 600,000, you don't pay stamp duty. All these things are really making these markets that tick all these boxes very strong, and it's allowing a lot of people to get into the marketplace. And living in Ballarat or in Geelong, it's a much more relaxed lifestyle. So people are opting to live there and either to commute to Melbourne to work or even stay there, because there's a lot of jobs created there too. So all these things are key factors to why we're seeing these great things happen in regional Victoria. And it's why that Reventon sells there too.
Yeah. Well, we think regional Victoria, generally speaking, is the strongest market jurisdiction in the country. It's been the case for the last 2 years, and it continues to be. There are many other locations we could talk about, but Ballarat's a great example of the dynamic that's happening in regional Victoria at the moment. And there was an article published in media just a couple of days ago, new figures from the Bureau of Statistics, and it says that Ballarat is now the fastest growing inland city in Australia. And it's growing at a rate of almost 1.9% a year, according to the latest figures. The national average is 1.6, so it's well above the national average, and it's growing faster than any city in Australia that's not on the coast, which is just another indication of the strength of this location as an economy and as a property market.
Yeah, I read that, and actually I thought, wow, what great news for all the investors that we put in that market, but also what strong indicators for what's going to happen in years to come.
Yeah. So just looking at some of the more specific real estate information about Ballarat, Chris, we've touched briefly on vacancy rates. The postcodes of Ballarat, we talked about Geelong a moment ago and how tight the rental market was there. It seems to be even more so in Ballarat. One postcode has a vacancy rate of 1.3% and another of the main postcodes 0.8%, so well under 1%. And so we're starting to see, again, rents are rising. And one of the indicators that I think property investors should look for is where rents are strong, prices will follow. I think that's one of the indicators that people can take to the bank, that a strong rental market is indicative of something, and price growth tends to follow.
100%, and also it's great for investors too, because if they've got strong rental yields, it means their holding costs won't be as high, which means you can really knock your mortgage on the head and build equity faster and duplicate that process. So always good to get a good rental yield.
Yeah, one of the things that you said you liked about Ballarat is the affordability of it. We're looking down the list of suburbs that are prominent in the city of Ballarat. Most of them still have median prices in the 300,000s. In fact, there's one, Sebastopol, that's still in the 200,000s, and there's a few that's just a little bit above 400,000. For buyers coming out of the big cities, such as Melbourne, that's a level of affordability that a Melbourne buyer can only dream about now, post the recent rise in prices. There's no suburbs left in Melbourne where you can get houses in the 300,000s. Definitely
not. And that, as I said, that's why it's an alternative market for people. And it's a good market for, obviously, home buyers to get into the market, but also investors, because it enables you to build equity, and then maybe you can look at moving your property on and buying in more affluent areas or more expensive areas. But either way, it's a good entry point into the marketplace, which is always a good thing.
Our data shows that most of the suburbs in Ballarat in the last 12 months have had median price growth above 10%, so they're all double-digit growth markets. But just reinforcing that, I think you're probably seeing this article as well, Chris, recently out of Domain, one of the big data providers in real estate around the country, listing the major suburbs around the country that have had the highest growth in median prices. And a suburb of Ballarat actually has topped the nation. And that's the suburb of Mount Pleasant, where its median price has grown 26% in the last 12 months. And that is nowhere in Australia has done better than that. And that, again, tells us something about what's happening in Ballarat and why your clients will be very happy they bought there.
100%. I'd like to preface one thing. I did mention if it goes up quick, be cautious. But the reason I'm not as cautious about this is because there's more than one key thing that's underpinning the growth of that. There's 4 or 5 key elements to what underpins it, which makes it a strong market. If it's one or two things like the mining, when you look at your areas when people were selling there, it was one thing, maximum 2 that was underpinning it. So as it went up quick, it also went down quick when the mining dried down in that area. So because there's so many key points that are holding this investment up or this area up, I'm not as worried about it for that reason.
Yeah. And its long-term growth rate is very good. When we look at the across all the suburbs of the city of Ballarat, we find that most of them, their long-term growth rates, that's the average over the last 10 years, 7 or 8% again. So again, very comparable to the best of the capital cities. And this is what it's done long-term. So the growth that we're seeing in the last 12 months, the strong growth throughout Ballarat is not a spike. It's the continuation of a trend of long-term performance. And the average, according to these Domain figures for Geelong in the last 12 months, is 11.3% a year. But the median price across Ballarat is still in the high 300,000. So it's retained that level of affordability while at the same time producing growth. We always look to the future when we look at an area. We're most interested in what's going to happen, what's coming up. We're interested in the present, but we're more interested in what's in the future because it tells us whether this is going to be an area that's going to continue to create jobs, economic activity, and out of that demand for real estate. And there's so much coming up in the future for Ballarat. The list of projects, large and small, is quite extensive. It adds up to many billions of dollars. Indeed, the wind farm projects that I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've got the Stockyard Hill wind farm, the Lel wind farm, and the Golden Plains and the Moorabool wind farm. There's 4 projects, add up there a value of $3.5 billion just in the wind farm projects alone. And there's so much more coming up in terms of government facilities, transport infrastructure improvements, and the rail links back to Melbourne, the highway links. There's $1 billion being spent on those. So the future feels to me like it's assured, and it's going to continue to help Ballarat be a growth property market.
I agree 100% with that.
Yeah. And yes, well, it's already the fastest growing inland city in Australia. Based on everything that's coming up in its future, we would expect it to continue to be right up there. Okay, time marches on. Chris, that's 2 of the 3 locations we want to touch on. Let's go into state. Let's look somewhere else in Australia, because it's not just about regional Victoria. There's strong markets in regional New South Wales. We're seeing some performance out of South Australia. We're seeing recovery in Western Australia. But in particular, Queensland, and in particular Southeast Queensland, is, we think, a market with particular prospects. And leading it at the moment is not so much Brisbane, but the Sunshine Coast.
Yes,
quite a remarkable story. And I know that you've been taking a particular interest in this market.
I have, and I've been looking at this market for a while now. So Geelong, we're heavily invested in both internally and for our clients for quite a number of years. Same so Ballarat, but probably within the last 12 to 18 months, we've been really taking notice of Sunshine Coast, and we're actually investing now a lot in there as well and putting our clients. So it's all these 3 areas are definitely 3 of our great areas that we're recommending to our clients, and we're going to obviously list a number of reasons to why that's the case. And I'm very, very excited about what's to come for Southeast Queensland.
Yeah, I mean, there are very few locations anywhere in Australia, including some capital cities, that have as much happening in terms of major infrastructure spending on the Sunshine Coast. It's kind of revolutionising it. We've talked in our discussion so far today about the importance of economic diversity. Now, in the past, the Sunshine Coast hasn't really had that. It's been very much a tourism economy, and that's always makes it a little bit fragile. But much has changed in the last, say, 3 to 5 years. Whole new industries have been created, in particular the medical precinct. That's a $5 billion work in progress, but the biggest part of it, the $2 billion university hospital, is already in place. It's up and running, and other things are following, and that's created not only a new industry, it's brought a lot of new people to the Sunshine Coast, many of them earning good money, and that's translated in demand, particularly the top end of the property market on the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, I agree. And as I said, it's a great lifestyle option as well to live there. You're on the coast, you're near the beach. There's a lot of great demand there. Property prices will continue to rise there for all those factors that you mentioned as well. And I've been hearing this for a while, that Queensland's a sleeping giant. But I'm very confident it's about to wake up, and it's going to do some great things, and that's why we're really focusing back in that area.
A lot of people have expected Brisbane to follow the booms that we saw in Sydney and Melbourne. I think it wasn't terribly sophisticated thinking. It was just the assumption that because Sydney and Melbourne had boomed, then Brisbane would naturally follow. But they overlooked the fact that those booms in the big cities happen for specific reasons. One of the things that's been missing in Brisbane has been infrastructure spending. That's a big factor, we think, and drive it.
That's huge. And one thing too, Terry, that I think people would make that assumption is because the median house price was so much lower, they thought it was going to catch up from an affordability point of view and all these things. And I think one of the biggest assumptions around that was because Sydney's median house price was so high, Melbourne's was here, Queensland was here, and they thought the gap was going to be bridged for that reason. And I heard that over and over again, but
Yeah.
You need a lot more data than just median house price. You need a lot more reasons to why an economy is going to boom. And as you said before, infrastructure is absolutely a massive factor to why this giant's about to wake up, hopefully, for all of our investors.
Well, when you're spending tens of billions of dollars on new roads and motorways and rail links and hospitals, as Sydney has been and Melbourne has been increasingly, it's a tremendous economic activity, and from that comes lots of new jobs.
Yep.
And it brings new people into work on those projects, and they're looking for somewhere to live, and so that drives the rental market and also the market for sales. That's been missing from Brisbane. It's changing. The ducks are starting to fall into line for Brisbane and southeast Queensland. And one area of southeast Queensland that is certainly spending big time on infrastructure is the Sunshine Coast. Over $20 billion when you add up all the projects that have just been completed or are under construction or in the pipeline. And there's some absolute game-changing projects. This is why I'm so excited about the Sunshine Coast as an economy and as a place for people to invest. There's the $5 billion medical precinct, Oceanside Kawana, it's otherwise known as. There's a couple of $1 billion being spent on the motorways that run along the western spine of the Sunshine Coast Strip. The airport is having $500 million spent on it, and it's going to be an international airport when they're finished.
Really?
And so the list goes on. And it's just a game changer for the Sunshine Coast and making it a tremendously mouth-watering prospect as a property market.
100%. And one thing too, I think we've got to put into consideration, the amount of money they're spending in the Brisbane casino, which I think is going to put Brisbane on the world stage. When you look at Crown Casino when it opened all those years ago in Melbourne, it did actually have a big impact, created a lot of jobs, created a lot of tourism, a lot of money being spent in the area. I think that's going to be a game changer for Brisbane as well. And yeah, it's such a big thing that's going to happen there. It's going to put them on the world map.
Yeah, and it's an important part of the mix for infrastructure spending in Brisbane, which is now starting to change for the positive. And we're also starting to see the population data favouring Queensland again. Traditionally, Queensland's been the biggest net gainer from interstate migration. It kind of lost that status in recent times, but it's now starting to get it back. In fact, it has got it back. In terms of interstate migration, Queensland's now number one again. Victoria is the leading state for population growth overall. A lot of it comes from overseas migrants. In the case of Queensland, we're now starting to see Queensland gaining a lot more from interstate migration, more so than any other state or territory now. And what we know to be true is 90% of it goes to southeast Queensland. And so it's going to Brisbane, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast. A lot of people leaving Sydney and heading to the southeast Queensland because of the affordability factor, the perhaps more relaxed lifestyle.
I agree. I mean, look at the weather up there. Look how less hectic it is. A lot of people are actually changing their views on living in major cities, like when you're in Melbourne or when you're in Sydney, and how hectic that is. So a lot of people are moving there to retire. A lot of people are moving there for lifestyle choices. It's just an easier, more relaxed lifestyle. Even when I vacate there and I look around, it's just a different pace. It's actually nice. It's refreshing to be there. And you can see why people are opting to live there.
And the Sunshine Coast is a great example of the lifestyle on offer. It's very different from the Gold Coast. It's a much less of a high-rise, glitzy tourism type market. It's more of a family market, very understated, beautiful beaches, lots of good places to eat. It offers a lot in that regard. And it's very much a growing city. It's currently the nation's 10th largest city, a population of about 350,000. And it's projected to reach 580,000 within about 22 years. So it's, again, like some of the other cities we've talked about today, it's projected to have tremendous growth. Just before we talk about some of the more specific real estate aspects of the Sunshine Coast, just want to remind people who are tuned in today that I'm sure you've got questions arising out of the discussion that Chris and I are having today. Please type your questions into the Q&A panel that you should see in front of you, or the chat box. Either one's as good as the other, and we'll do our best in the final sort of 10 or 15 minutes of today's broadcast to answer some of your questions. Vacancy rates, we've talked a lot about them in relation to Geelong and Ballarat. Equally so for the Sunshine Coast. We've got figures for all the postcodes that cover the Sunshine Coast Regional Council area and Noosa as well. And there's nothing even close to 3%. Most of them are around 2% or less. So we have this situation again, a very, very strong rental market. And that's starting to translate into pretty strong price growth. There was an article published by Domain, again, about a month ago. I mentioned earlier that those Domain figures found that one suburb in Ballarat had topped the nation in terms of growth for house prices. Well, the leading location in Australia for growth in median prices for apartments is Noosa Head on the Sunshine Coast, up 25%.
Yeah.
And again, it's not we don't see it as a spike, Chris. We see it very much as a trend, because right across the board we're seeing growth in the Sunshine Coast market, but particularly at the top end. And I think that's because so many new people are coming into the Sunshine Coast to work at the new medical facilities, for example, and many of them are earning pretty good money, and that's translating into demand at the top end of the Sunshine Coast market.
Yeah, I have a few friends that build and develop apartments there, and there's a lot of high-end sales there, and they're mainly in the medical profession or white-collar industry. And obviously their incomes, they've got high disposable incomes, and they're opting to obviously spend a bit more money in their property.
Yeah, I know a developer who's based actually here in Maloney, where I live, but he operates with his business in Brisbane and on the Sunshine Coast, and he's doing a project on the waterfront at Maroochydore, and the two top floors of that project have sold off the plan for the top floor sold for $6 million off the plan. The sub-penthouse underneath it, 5.7 million. Now, those sorts of prices for off-the-plan apartments have never been remotely approached on the Sunshine Coast before. And then we saw the sale of a second-hand apartment in Noosa Heads for over $8 million recently. So that tells you something's happening in the Sunshine Coast when you're achieving those sorts of prices for apartments in a market.
I agree, but one thing you're going to notice, these prices are going to become a lot more prevalent in areas like this, and it's going to become a lot more common because, as you mentioned, a lot of people with high disposable incomes going in these areas. Who would have thought 10 years ago you're going to be saying those figures in those areas in an apartment? I can certainly tell you that I didn't. I wouldn't expect that.
No, I'm absolutely stunned by those figures. But what it reflects is that it reflects what's happening in the economy of the Sunshine Coast. It reflects the fact that we've got these new industries, the new medical precinct. We've got the new CBD now under construction, which is going to be at least $5 billion investment in Maroochydore on a 50-hectare site right central on the Sunshine Coast. New people are coming to live and work in these big, new, exciting events that are happening in this economy, and it's translating in demand at the top end. So we're starting to see those sorts of prices achieved.
Definitely.
And there's a lot more coming up for the Sunshine Coast. We've got the international subsea broadband network cable coming in from Asia. It'll be the fastest internet link to Asia from anywhere on the east coast of Australia. We've got the airport going international. We've got the new CBD now under construction. It's going to extend over the next 10, 15 or more years as a generator of enormous activity. The Sunshine Coast is becoming a serious contender, a real city, not just a tourist town. It's becoming a real regional city, one of the biggest in Australia. Definitely
something all investors should consider when they're looking at investing. Definitely one of, obviously we mentioned it in our top 3 today, but definitely one that I'll have right on top of my radar at the current market.
Yeah. Okay, so we're very mindful of time marching on, and that people are tuning in today are probably doing so in a lunch break, and they probably need to get back to work at some point. So, and I think we've had a pretty in-depth, broad-ranging discussion of 3 very, very compelling markets around Australia. We're going to turn in a moment to your questions. But just before we do that, Chris, you've got some special information that you want to impart to people watching today in the form of special offers from Reventon.
I do. And these suburbs that we've discussed today, if you go to my website, reventon.com.au, and you go to the top right-hand side, you can get a free suburb report on all the areas we're discussing today, but any other suburb that you want to. And it's very, very important to do your due diligence before you invest in these areas and you speak to the right people. Now, let me pull up my offer for everybody. Okay. I think it's up. Good. Okay. Now, one of our awarded builders that we use, Glenville, are giving us a special offer for all of you who are listening: a free upgrade to the facade of a property, a free evaporated cooling, and from Reventon as well, we're going to offer you a 5K cash back at settlement. So it's valued at $11,000 for anyone listening to this hotspotting webinar. This is a special that's going on until the 11th of October. So please just fill in your details. We'll get somebody to call you and see if we can get this offer happening for you. So just to recap that, it's a free upgrade, evaporated cooling, 5K cash back valued to $11,000. It's to say thank you for listening.
And Chris, for those who would like to explore the possibility of taking up that offer or just following up and having a further chat, how do they do that? How do they take action?
Well, basically, if you type in, and we'll send a link to on the bottom here, reventon.com.au/Glenville-homes-offer/. I know that's a lot to remember, but we'll actually add that to the link. Click that in, fill in your details, and we'll contact you. And if it's possible, we can make this happen for you. We'll proceed down that path. It all starts with a conversation. It's no obligation, no cost to inquire. So please inquire and let's see if we can assist you.
Okay, we'll just leave that link on the screen, Chris, while we turn our attention to some of the questions. So please, people, be mindful of that offer. It's a great offer. And if you're interested in just finding out a little bit more, follow that link and we'll leave it on the screen so you've got plenty of time to note it down. It'll also be, everyone who's registered for today's event will receive a copy of this broadcast, and there will be a clickable link that they can use as well when they receive that, probably tomorrow. So let's turn to some questions. Lawrence is asking about Bendigo. We talked about Ballarat. I think we probably mentioned Bendigo briefly, and is asking where does Bendigo rank in our discussion. What do you think, Chris?
Look, we've discussed this quite a few times in detail, Terry. Bendigo has a similar story in terms of Ballarat, affordability, great rental yields, and it's a market that we sell in. We're not as active in that market as we are in Geelong or Ballarat for that matter, but it's a very similar story to Ballarat. It's definitely a good area to look at and consider for the reasons it's the entry point, great rental yields, and you can still get into that market, 450,000 plus, something along those lines. So definitely consider that. Yeah,
we at Hotspotting, we feel that Bendigo has similar qualities to Ballarat. They're very similar cities in lots of ways. They both have a lot of history, a wonderful historical fabric. Their links to Melbourne.
Population.
Yeah, similar size population, good links back to Melbourne, strong economy in their own right, lots of diversity. One of the standout things about Bendigo is the number of really big businesses that operate nationally, but have their headquarters there, like Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, which is the biggest bank in Australia after the Big Four, and then businesses like Thales, which build vehicles for the military and get $1 million contracts to do that kind of work. So there's a lot going on in Bendigo, similar level of affordability, similar pricing, similar rental yields, low vacancies. Yeah, similar story to Ballarat. So I guess the advantage that Ballarat has is it's a little bit closer to the capital city.
And I think one thing to mention too, Terry, that I think when you look at areas like Ballarat and Bendigo, it's very low risk investing because of all those factors. And it's a good way to get started into your property ventures, I believe. Okay.
Chris, a question for Chris from Des, asking, do you think it's too late to invest in the Sunshine Coast, especially when the big project started a couple of years ago? I certainly have an answer to that question myself, but what do you think, Chris?
Absolutely not. I think it's a great time. And as I mentioned before, we're actually actively, that will probably be one of our hottest markets that myself and my clients will be participating in next year. So I definitely think actually it's a great time to look at it, and it's definitely not too late. What do you think about that, Terry?
Look, I think the Sunshine Coast is really just at the beginning of something very special. I think it's very important, as we've mentioned earlier in the discussion, for investors to take a long-term view. So there are individual cycles, which can be quite short, maybe 2 or 3 years of growth, and then things level out, and then there may be another spurt of growth. But taking a long-term view in particular, I think the Sunshine Coast is a very good place to consider. I think it's just at the beginning of, I'm never sure whether to call it an evolution or a revolution, because the changes that's feeding into the Sunshine Coast economy are quite immense. I'm doing a major report at the moment. I call it the most compelling growth story anywhere in Australia. And I actually believe that. We researched the whole of the country, and there's nowhere else in Australia that really has the dynamic that the Sunshine Coast has, where it's really undergoing massive change through infrastructure spending, the creation of new industries, and just so many people coming to live and work there. Now, UE Insurance, which is one of the big insurers around the country, most people who watch TV will see their ads every single day. They've established their national headquarters on the Sunshine Coast. We're going to see a lot more of that, I believe, because this is becoming a serious city. So, yeah, not too late, Des. It's really at the beginning of something very, very big.
And just add one last point. It's one area that I'll be investing heavily in the next year or so, if that gives you any confidence or reassurance.
Okay. Azam is asking about the Gold Coast, and when do you think the high-rise market in Southport is going to pick up? And if so, how much? Do you have any focus at all on the Gold Coast, Chris, with your business?
The answer is no, and I'm not going to comment on something that I'm not really 100% over or researched on. So I'll leave that one to you. We don't focus that much on there because I think it's too volatile. I think it's got a long-term view till when it will correct itself or grow again. But yeah, I'm not active in that market, so I'm not going to say too much more than that. What do you think about that, Terry?
Yeah, I think that the Gold Coast has our current problem, and it's that it just continues to build too much.
An oversupply, yeah.
Oversupply tends to drag down the long-term performance of the Gold Coast. Now the housing market is a different matter. That what I call, the real people actually live and work on the Gold Coast. That's where they live. In the housing market's inland, and that market does perform over time. But the markets that attract investors erroneously, I believe, are the high-rise sector and the beachside suburbs. The Surfers Paradises, the Broad Beach, Main Beach, and there's been a lot built in Southport. That's really a speculator's market. It's all about tourism and overseas investors primarily. And look, they keep building too many, and the Gold Coast seems to lurch from one oversupply scenario to the next. And let me put it this way, the median price for an apartment in Surfers Paradise today is less than it was 10 years ago. And if that doesn't tell you something about those markets, then nothing else will.
Disappointing because it's such a nice area. Well, it's a good area to vacate and have a holiday. But yeah, definitely an oversupply, I think, is the reason why it hasn't performed.
Kerry's asking about another sort of volatile area. Do you see anything happening in Gladstone and Moranbah? I'm pretty sure that you don't put your clients into those areas because they don't tick the boxes that you look for. It doesn't have that.
No. The reason I stayed away from those areas, and I know there's some great areas in Perth as well, but I think they're underpinned by not enough factors, being the mining and stuff like that. So early spike that's underpinned by one or two things gives me red flags, so I stay away from that. So I personally don't invest there, and I put my clients there, because I think it's way too risky and it's way too volatile. So that's the reasons we stay away from those sort of markets.
Yeah, I think Kerry's asking for a particular reason. A lot of people actually own property in these markets and are wondering, are they going to pick up? Kerry, the evidence is that both Gladstone and Moranbah are now picking up. I know it's been a long, hard and painful wait for people who bought there perhaps half a dozen years ago or more. But vacancies have come down a lot in both places. Rents are starting to pick up, and we're starting to see sales activity rise, and prices are starting to fall. Moranbah median price is rising. It's got a long way to go to get back to those peak levels, of course, but those markets are now trending in the right direction. They were massively distorted by very, very big things that happened, creating a spike which was followed by a trough. Look, we have more questions, but we're almost come up to the hour, Chris, so it's probably a good time to wrap our discussion up. I think it's been really valuable for people out there watching and listening today, and who will tune in to perhaps listen to a copy of the broadcast. You will send to everyone who is registered for it today. We specifically and deliberately focused on some key regional markets because I think that these are the sorts of markets that investors should be considering. They're overlooked by media who are obsessed with the biggest cities and aren't telling us about these wonderful, strong growth economies and property markets that exist outside of the biggest cities. We've talked about Geelong, we've talked about Ballarat, and we've talked about the Sunshine. We could have talked about dozens of other locations that have good qualities as well, but we think that they are great examples of opportunities that exist right now for affordable investment with great growth potential.
Well, Terry, thank you very much to all the listeners out there. I hope you found value in our discussion. Terry, I always love discussing real estate with you. I can discuss it with you day in. So thank you very much for having me on. Thanks for your time. And if anyone needs any free reports, please go to our website, reventon.com.au, download the reports. If you've got any questions for us, shoot them through. Thank you very much, Terry, and everybody for listening.
And just before we go, I just want to draw your attention once again, just before we wrap it up, to the special offer from Reventon today. If you'd like to follow up with that, we've given you the details, the link, and we will be sending a copy of this broadcast to everyone who's registered, and that will, again, have a clickable link that you can follow up and go through the process to access that special offer, or just to follow up and ask further questions of the team at Reventon.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right.
Have a great day.
We're exactly 1 hour since the broadcast started. Chris, the timing is beautiful. I think the information has been great. I've enjoyed the discussion, as I always do, when you and I sit down and talk real estate. Let's do it again in a couple of months' time. Let's have another one.
I'll be looking forward to it. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks everyone for listening. Bye for now.
Bye.